Good morning, everyone. How's it going today? Very quick video today explaining to you a little bit about how to improve your skills and to make sure that you're not breaking them every time that you touch them. Skills have very quickly become sort of software already. Although instead of writing it with code, you're writing it in plain English. So we're going to have to figure out ways to improve our existing skills without breaking the previous functionalities that they already had. And this video is precisely about that. How to make your skills reliable, how to evaluate them, and how to test them. Let's get right into it. And for the record, we're going to be basing this video on this article that you see right here by OpenAI, which is a set of very good tips and tricks and good practices on how to write and evolve your skills for your agents, okay? So we're going to be going step by step on this, and we're going to be doing some demos on our existing skills at Hugging Face. All right, so first of all, let's start with the introduction about what actually skills are. And if you're not familiar with skills, feel free to watch this other video, which is a crash course on skills, where I show you everything that you need to know about what skills are, how they work, and how to install them using skills.sh. But right now, let's just cover this very quickly in a very quick summary. So skills have already become probably one of the most important pieces of modern coding agents, and basically any agents that are out there. If you're familiar with, for example, OpenClaw, skills are a crucial part of its architecture. And there are basically two kinds of skills. The first one are documentation skills, and the second one are workflow skills. Documentation skills teach the agent how to use existing tools. So for example, how to use a CLI tool, how to use an MCP server, how to use an API, etc. And they provide the advantage that they have progressive discoverability. So your agent will only read the skill if it needs to use that tool, which is very convenient. And there is also workflow skills, which define very specific steps that an agent must complete to finish a task. Now, there is a lot of discussion about this, and some people even say that documentation skills are completely useless, for example, like RIS or I actually agree with what he says. He says that for 90+% of skills, they're basically just existing documentation, but written for agents, which is probably true. And actually, I completely agree that this is by far not the most optimal way to use skills. The most optimal way to use skills is to have them include both documentation part and workflow skills, such like we have right here in the Hugging Face skills. This already viral skill, which helps you train a model using just your Claude Code or Codex. You can just ask Codex, hey, help me train this model on this data set, and it will completely do that for you because it has the entire workflow of how to do it, but it also has the scripts and the exact instructions on how to use the Hugging Face MCP, how to use the Hugging Face CLI to actually finish the training job for you by just prompting it, which is crazy. And in my opinion, that is what you're going to be aiming at. A skill that is both documentation about your tools, but also which encapsulates workflows that otherwise would have been done by a human. And this basically means that since skills contain real logic, they call other APIs, they'll call other skills, they will spawn sub-agents and stuff like that. They are basically software, but written in plain English. And software requires very robust validation, quality control, version control, and of course, evals, which is what we're going to be talking about right now. All right, so first let's set up the demo. And we're going to be working with the model trainer skill by Hugging Face. And this skill allows you to basically train or fine-tune a model by just prompting Codex or Claude Code to do it. And you're going to be able to just do fine-tune X model on Y dataset. And what Claude is going to do is it is going to validate your dataset format. It is going to select the appropriate hardware for your job and ideally find the most affordable one that will still get your job done, use and update a training script with Trackio monitoring, submit the job to Hugging Face Job so that it is trained on the Hugging Face infrastructure, report back the job ID and the estimated cost of the entire job, check on progress whenever you ask for it, and then help you debug if something goes wrong. So as you can see, this contains, of course, a workflow. And within the workflow, there are a lot of instructions on how to do specific things, how to use specific CLI tools, for example, the HF job CLI to submit the job. And it includes a lot of flexibility because with all of those instructions and with the capabilities of the language models that we're working with, it is going to help you also debug the thing if at some point something goes wrong. So that is what we're going to be working with. As you can see, here's the description. You can feel free to pause the video if you want to read it, but this is the description of the skill. Perfect. Now, in order to set up our scale to evaluate it and make sure that it is robust and that when we continue to grow it, it is going to keep improving and we're not going to break it, there are a few things that we need to do first. So first of all, we're going to need to define what success looks like for our skill. Then we're going to have to manually trigger the skill to make sure that it is working. And after that, we're going to create some tests for it with the help of Claude Code or Codex or whichever AI assistant you're using. And with time, we're going to have to evolve those tests and make sure that they keep working every time that we update the skill or we change something within it. So here's what the workflow is going to look like at a glance. First, we define what our skill is going to do. We trigger it manually. We create some tests to make sure that what we have already validated keeps working. And we just continue evolving the tests so that we don't ever break it. And that's going to be the life cycle of our skill. All right, so just as we mentioned before, the first thing to do is to define what actually means success for our skill. And in order to do that, we can actually explore 4 different dimensions to make things simpler. The first one is going to be the outcome. Did the agent actually produce the right result, what you expected it to do? The second one is going to be the process. Did it follow the expected instructions? Did it use the tools that you wanted it to use? Third is going to be the style. Did the result match the style that you wanted it to have? So for example, if the output is supposed to be a set of files, were the files named correctly? Were they in the right directory? And stuff like that. And finally, efficiency. Did it avoid unnecessary comments or tokens, or did it go down rabbit holes that it didn't need to explore in order to complete the task? This is important to identify so that you can, from the beginning, tell it not to explore that route in future runs. And in our case, for Model Trainer, we know that it has to create valid Hugging Face jobs for the training setup. It should follow the expected order of validating this data set, validating the configuration and launching the job. Then it should explain the actions clearly without any noisy narration, and it should avoid trashing the terminal with random extra steps, as we mentioned before. And I suppose that this is obvious, but in case it is not, scale files are supposed to be considered as software. So they should be version controlled. They should be in your Git repository. By version controlling your scale files, you're going to be able to map evaluations and possible errors to changes that you have done to your scales. So it is very, very important that you have your scales tracked in your repository. Now let's take a look at the next step, which is manually triggering the scale to validate it. All right, so the next step is to actually manually trigger the scale to make sure that it does what you wanted it to do from the start. Here are a few examples of prompts that we can use to validate that this is actually working. So here are 4 prompts. In the first one, I explicitly call the scale. So use Model Trainer to fine-tune a small model for text classification. In the second one, I implicitly call it, saying something like, I want to train a model on Hugging Face jobs for sentiment analysis. Then help me train a model should also call the skill, but it should guide me a little bit more about what it is going to do. And then you should also add some prompts for negative control that should not trigger the skill. So explain what model training is, should not trigger the skill, because we are not going to be starting off the workflow. And of course, as I mentioned before, you should capture the cases when the skill triggers, but it shouldn't, when it did not trigger, but it should have, and stuff like that, so that you can update the description of the skill, because that is the part that your agent sees and that it uses to decide whether it wants to use the skill or not. And of course, this part of manually testing your skill can be a little bit long, and it depends a lot on the kind of skill that you have. For example, this model trainer skill is going to take quite a bit of time to actually validate that it works, because training a model takes a few hours. But if your skill is something like setting up the development environment for a React application, for example, then you're going to be able to test this much faster. And in order to do this, a good recommendation is to actually allow your agent to spawn sub-agents with and without the skill and have it validate that with the skill it works better. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And now that sub-agents are not an experimental feature for Codex, you can also have them in Codex and have them run multiple prompts and evaluate the results. And over time, what I would recommend is that you create either a CSV file or a JSON file. Of course, you're going to be using an agent to create it, but it should have things like this. So it should have the ID of the test that you want to evaluate. It should have the should trigger to validate that that prompt actually triggers or not your skill. Then the prompt in itself. So here are the prompts that we mentioned before, such as use model trainer to fine tune a model. I want to train a model, etc. And then finally, the expected outcome. Now, in this particular example, the expected outcome is basically just a description of what it should do by the end of the run. But in a moment, I'm going to show you how to structure this a little bit more so that you can automate this later on with an LLM as a judge. But over time, this set of tests is going to continue growing so that whenever you make a change to your skill, you're going to be able to just run all of these tests and have them be validated by your agent, which is going to spawn up a bunch of sub-agents, each one of them with one prompt, and then validate that everything is still working correctly. Okay, so that would be the next step. And like that, we got to the final stage of the skill lifecycle, which would be to continue to evolve the tests and checks over time as you use the skill and as you, of course, add new features to it. So remember to start with high value checks like we did before, just like whether it runs or it doesn't run. Is the result what we wanted? Is it not? And then add cases of failure as they appear. So you will continue to use your skill. At some points, it will completely fail. You can just add that case as a prompt to your test cases that we saw before so that in future runs, you can test that to make sure that it works. After that, you can even evolve into more quantitative checks. So you can start evaluating if the skill is actually efficient. Did it just thrash out commands that it didn't need to use? Did it go down rabbit holes that it didn't need to use? And you can start validating that. And of course, this means that you're going to be able to measure not only that it happened, but how it happened, how the success was achieved. Now, something to keep in mind about skills is that of course, we are thinking of them as software, but they're different from regular software in the sense that skills usually work from the start because you're dealing with an LLM that is usually very smart. So if at some point your skill is very buggy or problematic, the agent is most likely just going to figure out a way to make it work. But that doesn't mean that it is going to be completely efficient and that it's going to make things in the best way. So you're going to have to continue monitoring that to make sure that the skill is exactly like you wanted it to be. And a final recommendation that I would like to give you is to add an LLM as a judge so that you can automatically evaluate your skill with sub-agents. So remember that I mentioned this part right here that you can create your CSV file with what you expect the outcome to be of your skill as the last column right here. You can even evolve that into some sort of an LLM as a judge with very clear rubrics of what success means. So you can define the outcome goal of your skill, the process goal, the style goal, and the efficiency goal, as we mentioned, and you can have the agent spawn up multiple sub-agents with the skill and have that agent, be it Codex or Claude Code or whatever, evaluate whether or not this actually checks. And you can, of course, if you want, evolve this LLM as a judge tests even further if you want a more thorough evaluation. For each goal, you want to have not only pass through, but also a quick comment about it, maybe a score for it. I personally use an internal skill to evaluate skills like this myself. It is not completely finished yet, so I cannot share it with you yet. But as soon as it is done, I can share it with you and maybe you can adopt it if you want it, which basically just copies this entire life cycle that I mentioned right here and implements it with Codex. And there you go. We have essentially covered everything that was in this article right here. Feel free to check it out if you want. It's going to be linked in the description anyways. And the final takeaway is that you do not want to evaluate your skills by vibe. You want to evaluate them as close as possible as you would evaluate software. So first of all, define what success means for your skill, then run controlled prompts and validate that they are actually working and that they produce the desired results with the desired process. Then score the behavior using deterministic and rubrics checks. And you can even use LLMs as a judge, as I showed you before. And then iterate and expand those test cases and those evaluations as your skill evolves and as you find different pain points so that your skill becomes very robust. And that's it for today's video. Thank you very much for watching. I would appreciate it if you like the video and if you subscribe. And with that, I will see you next time.